December 16, 1944. 0630 hours. The Ardennes Forest, Belgium. Hauptmann Klaus Richter pressed his frozen fingers against the trench wall and watched hell descend from above. The American artillery shells didn't behave like any ammunition he'd encountered in 4 years of war. They didn't impact the ground. They didn't require direct hits. They simply exploded. 30 feet above his men's heads, raining death downward into foxholes that had protected German infantry since 1914. In 3 minutes, his entire battalion, 702 soldiers, ceased to exist. The few who stumbled back through the snow couldn't speak coherently. They just repeated one phrase, over and over, Die Luft tötet. Die Luft tötet. The air kills. The air kills. Richter didn't know he'd just witnessed the combat debut of the proximity fuse, a device so revolutionary it would be called the second most important invention of the war, surpassed only by the atomic bomb itself. A miniature radar system crammed into an artillery shell. A weapon that could think. But this story doesn't begin in the frozen forests of Belgium. It begins 5 years earlier, in the desperate hours when Britain stood utterly alone against Nazi Germany, and one scientist proposed an idea that seemed like pure fantasy. October 30, 1939. Exeter, England. William Buteman sat in his cramped laboratory at the Air Defence Establishment and confronted a brutal mathematical reality. During the First World War, British anti-aircraft gunners had fired an average of 8,500 shells for each enemy aircraft destroyed. Now, with planes flying 3 times faster and twice as high, the ratio had worsened to 12,000 rounds per kill. If war came, and everyone knew it would, Britain would run out of shells before Germany ran out of planes. Buteman's solution was radical. What if artillery shells carried tiny radio transmitters that could detect approaching aircraft and detonate automatically at the optimal distance? No more guessing. No more wasted ammunition. Just, thinking shells. His colleagues thought he'd lost his mind. Radio equipment in 1939 filled entire rooms. Vacuum tubes were fragile as wine glasses. The idea of cramming functional radar into a space smaller than a coffee can, then subjecting it to forces 20,000 times normal gravity while spinning at 30,000 revolutions per minute, was absurd. By June 1940, as France collapsed and German panzer divisions reached the English Channel, British scientists had built crude prototypes. They worked in laboratory conditions. But the moment they were fired from actual guns, the delicate electronics shattered into useless fragments. Britain lacked the resources and industrial capacity to solve the problem. They needed help. Desperately. What happened next represented one of the most extraordinary gambles in military history. September 6, 1940. Halifax, Nova Scotia. The Canadian Pacific liner Duchess of Richmond slipped into harbor carrying cargo more valuable than gold, a small black metal box containing every major British military secret. Radar systems. Jet engine designs. Chemical weapons research. Explosive technologies. Everything. Sir Henry Tizard, Britain's chief scientific advisor, had convinced Winston Churchill to share it all with the United States, a nation not yet at war, in the desperate hope that American industrial might could transform British ideas into actual weapons before Britain was invaded. The risk was staggering. If America remained neutral, Britain would have armed a potential future enemy. If the secrets leaked to Germany, the war was over. On September 19, in a Washington conference room, Tizard opened that black box for a young American physicist named Merle Tuve. Tuve, 39 years old, had grown up in rural South Dakota tinkering with homemade radio sets alongside his childhood friend Ernest Lawrence, who would later win the Nobel Prize in Physics. Just weeks earlier, Vannevar Bush had appointed him to lead a secret new program, Section T of the National Defense Research Committee. Its sole mission, develop a working proximity fuse. As Tizard explained the British research, Tuve sat transfixed. 1 month earlier, he'd been listening to radio broadcasts from London with his wife. The reporter described children being pulled from rubble. Entire neighborhoods eliminated. The desperate inadequacy of British air defenses. Tuve had turned to his wife with tears streaming down his face. We have to find a way to stop those bombers. Technology has to provide the answer. Now Tizard was handing him exactly that chance. But the British concept, while brilliant, remained purely theoretical. No one had solved the fundamental problem, how to make electronics that could survive being shot from a gun. Tuve left that meeting understanding that hundreds of thousands of lives, British, American, German, Japanese, would depend on what he did next. The challenge seemed impossible. The solution would require inventions that didn't yet exist, manufacturing techniques never before attempted, and production at a scale that defied imagination. December 1940. Washington, D.C. The mansion at 5241, Broad Branch Road had been transformed into the nerve center of America's most secret weapons program. Tuve assembled a team of brilliant physicists, Richard Roberts, who'd worked with Niels Bohr. Lloyd Berkner, a pioneer in ionospheric research. And a 26-year-old physicist named James Van Allen, whose later discovery of Earth's radiation belts would make him famous, but whose wartime contribution would remain classified for decades. The challenge they faced defied every assumption about electronics. A proximity fuse needed to be a complete radar system, transmitter, receiver, amplifier, and detonator, compressed into a space smaller than a soda can. It needed to generate radio waves, detect their reflection from targets, process the signal, and trigger detonation, all while experiencing forces that would obliterate any conventional electronic device. Van Allen took on the most fundamental challenge, creating vacuum tubes that could survive being fired from a gun. Traditional tubes shattered at just 100 times gravity. The proximity fuse would need to survive forces 200 times greater. For 6 months, Van Allen worked 18-hour days with Raytheon, a Massachusetts hearing aid company. They tried everything. Rigid filament structures. Shock-absorbing materials. New glass formulations. Everything failed. The breakthrough came in January 1941 with what Van Allen called his mousetrap spring, a mechanical system that locked tube filaments in place during the massive acceleration of firing, then released them for normal operation during flight. It was elegant. Simple. And it worked. Lloyd Berkner solved another crucial puzzle, designing circuits that used separate transmitter and receiver functions, dramatically improving detection range. Henry Porter developed the reserve battery system, liquid electrolyte stored in a glass ampoule that would shatter during firing, activating the battery only when needed. By March 1942, they'd outgrown their facilities. Johns Hopkins University established the Applied Physics Laboratory in an abandoned Chevrolet dealership in Silver Spring, Maryland. When the first scientists arrived, the building still smelled of motor oil and rubber. Within weeks, it housed the most advanced electronics laboratory in the world. Tuve became the lab's first director, establishing a culture of organized desperation. Signs appeared on every wall: "I don't want any damn fool in this laboratory to save money. I only want him to save time." Another read: "Our moral responsibility goes all the way to the final battle use of this unit. Its failure there is our failure." What they achieved still seems impossible by today's standards. Inside a space barely 5 inches long and 2 inches in diameter, they packed 4 miniaturized vacuum tubes, 130 electronic components, a wet cell battery, safety mechanisms, and a detonator system. The fuse operated as a continuous wave radar, transmitting at frequencies that in 1940 were considered cutting edge. When radio waves bounced off approaching targets, they created interference patterns that triggered detonation. The power source was revolutionary, a reserve battery using liquid electrolyte that activated during flight but had unlimited shelf life before use. Safety systems prevented premature detonation through centrifugal switches and arming delays. By autumn 1942, they had working prototypes. Now came the truly impossible part, transforming a handmade laboratory miracle into mass production. Millions of units. Absolute reliability. Immediate deployment. They would need to mobilize the entire American electronics industry. January 5, 1943. Southwest Pacific, near Guadalcanal. Lieutenant Russell, Red Cochrane commanded the aft 5-inch battery aboard USS Helena. His radar operator called out approaching contacts, for Japanese Aichi Val dive bombers at 12,000 feet. In the magazine below, gunners loaded shells marked with special green bands, the Navy's code for proximity-fused ammunition. Cochrane had been briefed just days before. These shells didn't need direct hits. They only needed to pass within 70 feet of a target. Range 8,000 yards and closing, the rangefinder operator announced. Commence firing. The first salvo erupted. The shells traced red arcs across the morning sky, passing near the lead valve. Nothing happened. Still too distant. The second salvo followed 15 seconds later. At 5,000 yards from Helena, one shell passed approximately 60 feet from the lead bomber. The explosion looked different from anything Cochrane had ever seen. Instead of the shell continuing past the plane or exploding on impact, it detonated in midair, sending a perfect sphere of fragments outward. The valve's wing sheared off instantly. The engine burst into flames. The aircraft simply ceased flying, transforming from a controlled dive bomber into a tumbling mass of burning aluminum. Splash 1. 3 more salvos. 12 more proximity-fused shells. A second valve exploded when a shell detonated 40 feet below its fuselage. In the radio room, the combat report was already being encoded, enemy aircraft engaged with special ammunition. 2 confirmed destroyed. Ammunition performance exceeded all expectations. What the report didn't capture was the psychological impact on Helena's crew. Gunner's mate First Class Anthony Puleo would later recall, "We couldn't believe it. For months we'd fired thousands of rounds at planes, maybe hitting one if we were lucky. Now we were knocking them down with just a few shots. It felt like God himself was guiding our shells." Word spread through the Pacific Fleet with stunning speed. Every ship demanded proximity fuses immediately. Production ramped up at rates that defied comprehension. Powell Crosley Jr., who'd made his fortune selling radios and refrigerators, converted his entire Cincinnati facility to proximity fuse production. Assembly lines operated 24 hours daily, 7 days weekly. By spring 1943, American factories were producing 8,000 proximity fuses every single day. Sylvania Electric Products in Massachusetts employed 10,000 workers, 80% women, in a facility that had been farmland 18 months earlier. They produced miniature vacuum tubes at a rate equal to 2/3 of America's entire pre-war vacuum tube output. Betty Morrison worked the assembly line at Crosley from 1943 to 1945. In a 1995 interview, she recalled, "We didn't know what we were making. Security was unbelievable. We were searched entering and leaving. No purses, no bags, nothing. We sat at benches 8 hours daily, soldering tiny components. Supervisors told us we were making radio parts for aircraft. Only after the war did we learn we'd been building the weapons that saved so many of our boys." The human cost emerged only decades later. Workers used beryllium for soldering, unaware of its toxicity. Betty's mother was diagnosed with beryllium disease in 1983. She died 3 years later, her lungs destroyed. A casualty of war, just 40 years delayed. June 19, 1944. Philippine Sea, 200 miles west of Guam. Lieutenant James Van Allen stood on the flag bridge of USS Washington watching radar screens fill with approaching contacts. The same James Van Allen who developed the shock-proof vacuum tubes now witnessed his invention's ultimate test. The Japanese had launched their entire carrier aviation strength, 423 aircraft, in a desperate attempt to destroy the American fleet supporting the Marianas invasion. Raid 1, bearing 265, Angels 20. 69 aircraft, announced Combat Information Center. As Hellcat fighters tore into the Japanese formations, those that broke through faced a wall of proximity-fused anti-aircraft fire unlike anything in naval history. Van Allen watched from Washington's bridge as the sky filled with black puffs, each representing a proximity-fused detonation. Japanese planes began falling like rain. A Zero fighter dove on USS South Dakota. Van Allen watched the cruiser's 5-inch guns track smoothly, firing measured bursts. The third shell detonated 50 feet from the Zero. The plane didn't explode. It simply came apart. Wings separating from fuselage. Engine falling free. Pilot's body tumbling through space. It was systematic slaughter, Van Allen would later write to his wife. The proximity fuses turned our ships into fortresses. The Japanese pilots were brave. They kept coming even as their squadrons were annihilated. But courage couldn't overcome technology. By day's end, the Japanese had lost 315 carrier aircraft plus 50 land-based planes. American losses, 29 aircraft, mostly from operational accidents. The one-sided nature of the battle effectively ended Japanese carrier aviation as an offensive force. They would never again launch a conventional carrier strike. Their next major tactic would be born from technological desperation, kamikaze. October 25, 1944. Leyte Gulf, Philippines. Lieutenant Commander Robert Roberts watched in horror from USS White Plains as a Zero fighter, already burning from anti-aircraft hits, deliberately crashed into USS St. Louis flight deck. The explosion detonated torpedo warheads in the hangar deck. Within minutes, St. Louis rolled over and sank. The first major warship lost to kamikaze attack. The Japanese had discovered the only way to counter proximity fuses, eliminate the need to survive. A plane destroyed 50 feet from its target by a proximity fuse had failed its mission. A kamikaze destroyed 50 feet from its target would still crash into the ship through momentum. The divine wind had begun. But even against kamikaze attacks, proximity fuses proved invaluable. During the Philippines campaign, anti-aircraft guns claimed 231 kills from 364 kamikaze attacks, a 64% success rate. Without proximity fuses, American casualties would have doubled or tripled. The ultimate test came at Okinawa. May 11, 1945. Radar Picket Station 15, 60 miles north of Okinawa. Commander Barton J. Mullaney of USS Hadley watched the radar screen with growing dread. Kikyusui No. 6 was incoming, over 150 Japanese aircraft in coordinated kamikaze attack. Hadley and USS Evans stood alone at the picket station, the fleet's early warning and first defense. Multiple raids, all vectors. Estimated 150 plus bandits, Combat Information Center reported. Mullaney had drilled his crew relentlessly. Every 5-inch magazine was loaded entirely with proximity-fused shells. The gun crews could maintain 15 rounds per minute per gun indefinitely. At 1,520 hours, the first wave attacked. 12 aircraft from the north. Hadley's guns opened fire at 12,000 yards. The proximity fuses began their deadly work. First plane destroyed at 8,000 yards. Second at 6,000. Third at 4,000. The fourth kamikaze, already burning, crashed 50 yards off the starboard beam, showering the ship with debris but causing no serious damage. But this was just the beginning. For the next 95 minutes, Hadley fought for survival against continuous waves of attackers. Gun barrels glowed red-hot. Ammunition handlers collapsed from exhaustion and were replaced. The proximity fuses never stopped working. Gunner's mate Second Class Robert Eiley later testified, they came from everywhere. High, low, all directions. The proximity fuses were beautiful. We'd fire, and 3 seconds later there'd be an explosion and burning pieces falling. Fire again. Another explosion. It was like a rhythm. Boom boom boom, wait, explosion. Boom boom boom, explosion. At 1,615 hours, Hadley's luck ran out. 3 kamikazes, all heavily damaged by proximity fuse explosions but still flying, crashed into the ship in quick succession. A bomb exploded in the after-engine room. Hadley was devastated, 30 killed, 68 wounded, engineering spaces flooded, fires raging. But the ship survived. And the gun crews kept fighting. Even as damage control parties fought fires and flooding, the forward guns continued engaging aircraft. When the action ended at 1,655 hours, Hadley had shot down 23 aircraft, an all-time record for a destroyer in a single engagement. Commander Mullaney's after-action report stated, "The proximity fuse was indispensable to our survival. Without it, we would have been overwhelmed in the first 20 minutes." The Okinawa campaign's final statistics were sobering. 1,900 Japanese aircraft in kamikaze attacks. 368 U.S. ships damaged. 34 sunk. 4,907 sailors killed. Yet post-war analysis concluded that without proximity fuses, casualties would have exceeded 15,000 with over 100 ships sunk. The proximity fuse made the difference between painful victory and potential defeat. June 13, 1944. London. The distinctive pulse-jet engine sound echoed across the city, a harsh buzzing that would soon terrorize millions. The first V-1 flying bomb of the main offensive impacted in Grove Road, Bethnal Green, killing 6 civilians. Hitler's revenge weapon had arrived. But unlike the Blitz of 1940-41, London now possessed a defense that would have seemed miraculous 4 years earlier. On June 12, one day before the V-1 offensive began, Winston Churchill made a decision that would save thousands of lives. Against security officials' advice, fearing the technology would fall into German hands, Churchill authorized proximity fuses for London's defense. General Sir Frederick Pyle had deployed 500 heavy anti-aircraft guns in a defensive belt south of London. Each gun was linked to SCR-584 microwave radar and M9 electronic gun directors, creating an automated defensive system. But without proximity fuses, even this sophisticated system achieved only 24% success rates in the first week. Squadron leader Prudence Hill, serving at RAF Stanmore, tracked the transformation. The first week was terrifying. "We'd plot dozens of V-1s approaching London, and most got through. Then something changed. Suddenly the guns started destroying everything. V-1 after V-1 disappearing 10 miles from London. What Hill witnessed was the arrival of proximity fuses flown directly from American production lines. By the second week, gunners were destroying 46% of engaged V-1s. Third week, 67%. Fourth week, 79%. The improvement was so dramatic that German intelligence reported to Hitler that the British must have developed a secret anti-robot weapon. On August 28, 1944, the defensive system achieved its ultimate success. Early warning radar detected 104 V-1s launched at London. The proximity-fused guns destroyed 96. RAF fighters got 4. Only 4 reached London. The V-1 threat was effectively neutralized. Churchill would later write, "The proximity fuse, more than any other development, saved London from devastation by flying bombs." December 16, 1944. Monschau, Germany. Full circle. Colonel Oscar Alfred Axelson of the 406th Artillery Group received frantic reports. German forces were attacking in overwhelming strength. The 38th Cavalry Squadron was outnumbered 10-1. Axelson faced a terrible decision. In his ammunition bunkers sat thousands of proximity-fused shells with strict orders, not to be used in ground combat under any circumstances. Risk of capture too great. But without them, the cavalry squadron would be overrun within hours. At 0600 hours, Axelson gave the order that would revolutionize ground warfare: load proximity fuses. Set for airburst. The first salvo landed among German infantry advancing across snow-covered fields. Instead of exploding on impact, the shells detonated at optimal height above ground. The effect was apocalyptic. Fragments rained downward in lethal cones, reaching into foxholes, behind walls, under vehicles. There was no cover. No protection. Nowhere to hide. Forward observer Lieutenant Richard Ralston reported, first salvo airburst over German infantry company in open. Estimate 80% casualties. Survivors running to woodline. The second salvo airburst in the trees. The combination of shell fragments and wood splinters created a killing zone 100 yards deep. German soldiers, veterans of 4 years of combat, experienced something entirely new, artillery that killed regardless of cover. Feldwebel Otto Hartmann, captured 2 days later, testified, the artillery was unlike anything we'd experienced. We dove into foxholes, but shells exploded above us. We ran to forests, but shells exploded in treetops. Men screamed that Americans had a new secret weapon. Entire platoons eliminated in seconds. By December 19, Eisenhower had formally requested permission to use proximity fuses across the entire front. Authorization came December 21. Within hours, every American artillery unit in the Ardennes was firing proximity-fused shells. General George Patton wrote to the War Department on December 28, "The new shell with the funny fuse is devastating. The other night we caught a German battalion crossing the Sauer River. We hit them with proximity fuses. Battalion time on target. By actual count, 702 dead. The few survivors surrendered immediately. This is a magnificent weapon." He added prophetically, "I think when all armies get this shell, we'll have to devise some new method of warfare. I'm glad you thought of it first." The proximity fuse's impact can be measured in stark mathematics. Naval warfare, pre-proximity fuse, 500 to 2,000 rounds per aircraft destroyed. With proximity fuses, 155 rounds per aircraft destroyed. 600 to 1200% improvement. V1 defense, 2,340 V1s destroyed by proximity fuses. Without them, only 560 would have been destroyed. The additional 1,780 V1s would have killed 9,000 civilians. Battle of the Bulge, 200,000 proximity-fused shells fired in 2 weeks. Estimated 10,000 to 15,000 German casualties. Traditional artillery would have achieved perhaps 2,000. Production, 22 million proximity fuses manufactured. 87 companies. 110 factories. 80,000 workers. $1 billion invested. The cost per kill proved remarkable efficiency. While proximity fuses cost more per round, they achieved kills with 69% fewer rounds, reducing gun barrel wear, crew fatigue, and logistical burden. The testimonials from Allied leadership placed the proximity fuse among the war's most decisive technologies. Vannevar Bush, no other development save radar and the atomic bomb had comparable impact on the war's outcome. Eisenhower, if Germans had perfected these weapons 6 months earlier, our invasion would have proven exceedingly difficult, perhaps impossible. The proximity fuse gave us decisive advantage at the critical moment. Admiral Willis Lee, the proximity fuse made kamikaze survivable. Without it, we'd have lost half the fleet at Okinawa. Churchill, a weapon of defense more valuable than any offensive weapon save the atomic bomb itself. Even German Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt acknowledged, the American proximity fuse made our traditional defensive positions untenable. We could no longer rely on entrenchments. It was a revolution we could neither match nor counter. When American technical intelligence teams raced through defeated Germany in May 1945, they made a shocking discovery. In underground facilities and abandoned laboratories, they found extensive German proximity fuse research, far more advanced than anticipated, but still years from deployment. Dr. Albert Speer, Hitler's armaments minister, explained during interrogation, "We knew about proximity fuses from captured American shells in December 1944. Our scientists said they were impossible. When we finally believed they were real, it was too late. We lacked the vacuum tube technology, production facilities, and most importantly, time. The German failure revealed the proximity fuse's true achievement, not just technical innovation, but marriage of science and industry on a scale only America could achieve. While the proximity fuse saved countless Allied lives, its production carried hidden costs. The beryllium used in manufacturing proved deadly. Workers handled beryllium-copper alloys daily, unaware of toxicity. Beryllium disease, with its 20 to 60-year latency, struck hundreds, perhaps thousands, decades later. Margaret Chen, whose mother worked at Sylvania, testified before Congress in 2001, "My mother soldered proximity fuse components for 3 years. She was proud." In 1978 she developed beryllium disease. She died in 1983, drowning in her own lungs. She was a casualty of war, just 40 years delayed. These women were soldiers in the war effort. They handled dangerous materials without protection because nobody knew the dangers. They saved thousands of lives at the cost of their own, just delayed by decades. The proximity fuse didn't just win battles. It revolutionized military doctrine. For 500 years, since gunpowder's introduction, artillery had been primarily direct fire or ground burst. Soldiers protected themselves by digging in. The proximity fuse made entrenchments death traps. Dispersion became essential. Overhead cover became mandatory. Movement replaced entrenchment. The proximity fuse represented the first great example of successful Anglo-American technology transfer, a model that would define Allied cooperation through the Cold War. Sir Henry Tizard reflected, "We gave Americans our ideas. They gave us back millions of weapons. It was the best trade Britain ever made." The proximity fuse's impact extended far beyond World War II. Miniaturization techniques directly influenced transistor development and integrated circuit design. James Van Allen applied shock-hardening methods to instruments aboard Explorer 1, discovering the Van Allen radiation belts. Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Laboratory, created specifically for proximity fuse development, continues as one of America's premier defense research institutions. The proximity fuse itself evolved into modern smart weapons. Today's radar-guided missiles, laser-guided bombs, and GPS-directed munitions all trace their lineage to the first smart weapon, the proximity fuse. The concept of a thinking weapon, one making decisions without human intervention, began with Merle Tuve's vacuum tubes. Behind every proximity fuse lay human stories of innovation, sacrifice, and determination. Merle Tuve never recovered from the war's intensity. Colleagues found him in 1946 sitting alone in his empty laboratory, weeping. "All those boys who died while we were still developing the fuse. If we'd been faster, even by weeks, how many would have lived?" James Van Allen parlayed wartime experience into space research. When asked about his wartime work, he would say simply, "I helped save lives. Everything else pales in comparison." The women who assembled proximity fuses, Betty Morrison, Marie Collins, thousands whose names are lost, carried their secret service quietly. Most never knew what they built until decades later, if at all. The soldiers and sailors who fired proximity fuses understood their value immediately. Gunner's mate Anthony Puleo spoke for many, "Those green-banded shells were like having God on our side." History remembers generals and admirals, famous battles and dramatic moments. It often forgets scientists and workers who created victory's tools. Merle Tuve died in 1982, his name unknown to most Americans despite his decisive contribution. James Van Allen achieved fame for space research, his wartime work overshadowed. Lloyd Berkner, Richard Roberts, Henry Porter, their names appear only in technical histories. The women who assembled proximity fuses remain almost entirely forgotten. No monuments honor their service. No medals recognize their contribution. Yet their patient precision, working with deadly materials they didn't understand, building weapons they couldn't comprehend, saved more lives than most decorated heroes. Perhaps that anonymity is fitting. The proximity fuse succeeded through collective effort. British scientists sharing secrets. American researchers solving impossible problems. Factory workers assembling miracles. Soldiers employing revolutionary weapons. No single hero. Hundreds of thousands contributing to common cause. 2 weeks after Monshaw, as 1944 turned to 1945, Hauptmann Klaus Richter made his final diary entry. The Battle of the Bulge was failing. German forces retreating. American proximity-fused artillery continuing its relentless thunder. We face not just American soldiers but American science. Their shells think. They calculate. They decide when to kill. We are fighting the future itself, and the future is winning. God help Germany, for we have awakened a giant whose weapons are guided by intelligence. Richter couldn't know how right he was. The proximity fuse represented more than superior technology. It embodied the advantage of free societies mobilizing civilian expertise for military purposes. The proximity fuse was democracy's weapon, created by free people, manufactured by free workers, employed by free soldiers defending freedom itself. From Buteman's October 1939 concept to mass production by 1943, the proximity fuse traveled from British desperation through American innovation to Allied victory. It saved hundreds of thousands of lives, shortened the war, and introduced the age of intelligent weapons continuing today. The proximity fuse proved wars could be won not just through courage and sacrifice, but through superior technology and industrial might. It demonstrated thinking weapons could multiply force beyond previous imagination. Most importantly, it showed free nations pooling intellectual and industrial resources could achieve miracles totalitarian states could only dream about. In those vacuum tubes that survived impossible forces. In those circuits that detected approaching death. In those assemblies soldered with perfect precision lay the margin between victory and defeat, between freedom and tyranny, between the world we inherited and one too terrible to contemplate. The proximity fuse was the war's most effective secret weapon. Not because it was most powerful, but because it was used everywhere, continuously, decisively. It was the weapon that thought. And in thinking, it helped thinking people preserve their freedom to think. The German soldiers at Elsenborn Ridge, huddled in bunkers that could no longer protect them, had encountered more than superior firepower. They had met the future. A future where intelligence embedded in weapons would multiply human capability beyond imagination. That future, born in desperate days of 1940, tested in World War's crucible, and proven on battlefields from Pacific to Europe, began with a simple idea: what if an artillery shell could think? The answer saved the free world.